It's time for a confession. I don't learn tunes anymore. Today, I want to share a little bit about my journey from being a musician who used to really take pride in the fact that at any point I could draw from a repertoire of a few hundred standards that I could play on any given gig and feel confident, to now today feeling like I'm someone who would much rather invest my practice time into performing tunes like this. And this. And this. Today, we're talking about why I stopped learning tunes, but you still should. Since I know this perspective is likely to be an unpopular one with some musicians, I'm actually pretty sympathetic to that perspective. Rather than just telling me why I'm wrong, why don't you hit me in the comments with a little bit about where you're coming from on this? Why do you still learn tunes? What do you feel like this does for your playing? How has this helped your development? Maybe most importantly, how does this connect with who you feel like you are as a creative individual? And I'm really interested to hear from you rather than just be like, ha ha ha, Shawn, you're wrong. You got to learn tunes. Of course, we got to learn tunes. We're going to break that down a little bit today, but I really want to hear from you about what this does for your musicianship. In addition, I would really encourage you to check out the stuff that's available on Patreon this week. It's free for everyone this week. I do that occasionally just to sort of kind of show you what's going on over there. There's a handful of resources. There's an additional practice video where we're going to sort of work through a tune together, how we would actually learn a tune. There are some handouts, including a tune list for this week. That is the first 20 standards that I like to see students working on. No blues heads here, as these are all just like standards that are not blueses. Also no ballads. I tend to find that ballads are, really personal to different players. You got to know some ballads, but I didn't include that on the list. And especially as I was trying to narrow the list down to 20, I just decided to leave ballads off it for this list. It's by no means definitive. It's just some ones that I like to see players working on when they're in the development phase. They are important standards to know. Most of these are a little bit on the easier side. And in addition to just the tunes, there's also some good reference recordings. They're all sort of broken down about where you want to find some reference recordings for these, and also the key concepts on each tune. Not every concept, but just like what is the key concept on this particular song. So if I'm trying to practice this tune, I know I got to work on this concept. So be careful that you're really checking that out this week because like I said, it is free. So why do we even care about this? Why do we care what I'm doing in my sort of tune learning and standard learning process? I'm hoping that my sort of journey on this topic can be insightful to different players. The way we interact with sort of standard material in any art form that we're dealing with, whether we're playing jazz, classical music, any other art form, we've got to interact with sort of the stuff that's already been laid down before us in order to know what we want to do with it. And hopefully my journey can just be helpful in the way you think about this stuff. So if we go all the way back to when I was, a young fledgling trombone player, basically from high school into undergrad into my master's degree and through a fair amount of my sort of adult music career, I learned tunes. I was a diligent tune learner. I did all the stuff you should do. When I played gigs, went to jam sessions, whatever, if there were tunes that were called that I didn't know, I made note of them. At first on a little, notepad, and now, maybe on my phone or something like that so that I could learn those tunes later. I, for the most part, learned tunes by ear from recordings. Maybe in the very, end of high school, very beginning of college, before I really knew that's how you were supposed to do it, I was probably learning them out of the real book more. But once I kind of figured out that, I really need to learn them from recordings, that's what I did. I kept a list of the tunes that I knew, so that way I could always be adding to it and periodically go through and actually review some of those tunes that I wasn't sure if I knew. This was a huge part of my musicianship up until, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Now, of course, the end result of actually just knowing a lot of tunes that I could call at any time was important. But I would actually argue the more important component of this was the process that I went through to learn those tunes. Not just the process of actually getting the melodies and all that sort of stuff, but what I figured out about playing from learning those tunes. Many of these songs have lessons embedded in them. And if you're looking at them in that way, not just like, oh, I got to learn this tune to play a gig, but actually, what can I learn from this standard? It can do wonderful things for your playing. Let's look at a standard that I would consider a must-know if you're sort of in this part of your development where you're really trying to get in touch with the repertoire. That is the Clifford Brown tune, Joy Spring. So there's a number of things you got to work on this tune. The first thing you might want to identify is that there are 4 main key centers. Can you play ideas in those 4 main key centers? In addition to our 4 main key centers, there are actually 2-5-1s in 6 different keys in this tune. Now, if you listen to Clifford Brown play this tune, he not only plays in those key centers, but he also plays a little bit of blues-inflected ideas in those key centers. And finally, you got to ask yourself, can I construct 8th note and 16th note lines with the sort of elegance and refinement that Clifford does on this tune? Now, that's enough stuff to keep you busy for a minute practicing this tune. If you look at every tune that you know in this way, and you're able to take them apart in this manner and practice them in this manner, you are going to be a long way down the path to sounding great. Now, you got to balance that with actually just learning the material. It's a balancing act. If you go this deep on every single tune, you might only be able to get through, maybe 20 tunes in a year. Maybe more than that, maybe less than that. But if you're in the development phase where you're really trying to get your repertoire together, you ideally want to be able to get through more material than that. And a lot of these tunes are going to have concepts that do carry over. But at least on some of the material, you really want to go deep on it. That's what's going to really benefit your playing the most and really get you in touch with the process of connecting with standard repertoire. So if learning standards is such an important part of our development as musicians, what changed for me? And what made me feel like this was no longer a huge place I wanted to invest my practice time? Well, in 2017, my wife and I made a big move that was to a city very far away from where we had ever lived before. And this really caused me to take stock of some of my priorities as a professional, as a creative individual. Now, at the time, I was still playing a fair amount of straight ahead jazz, especially before the pandemic. And all that work I had done to make sure I knew a lot of tunes was really sort of paying off because the tunes that people were playing in this new locale, I already knew. At first, this left some pretty big question marks in my mind about what kind of musician I was becoming. But eventually, it actually became pretty liberating to no longer have the constant pressure of, oh, Shawn, you got to learn more tunes. Or, oh man, somebody's going to call a tune on me on a session or on a gig, and I'm going to look like a hack for not knowing whatever standard that I think people should know. While part of me certainly does miss playing a lot of those type of gigs, there's something that's fun about them in a way. But for the most part, I really realized that I was never really very good in that format. That's not actually the format that I think I am able to play my best. As I said, I always find those kind of gigs relatively stressful. I tend to work better in a situation where there's A, set list. B, we know how tunes, for example, are going to start and end. And if there are any other bonus sort of transitional figures or anything like there versus sort of figuring it out on the fly. That is just not the way that I perform my best. For some people, it is. They like that sort of in the moment thing. That doesn't work so well for my musicianship. And I've really had to get in touch with there's not just one way to be a creative improvising musician. So that brings us all the way up to today and thinking about what lessons can we learn from my journey on this, from somebody who really valued standard repertoire as a big part of sort of their development to now being someone who maybe values it a little bit less. I'm certainly not going to never learn a standard again. That doesn't really make sense. I'm sure I will learn other tunes, but it's not the main thrust of my practice. The first thing that I want you to take away from this is that if you want to play material well, whether that's standards, your own music, whatever, you need to memorize it. Of course, we all need to read stuff sometimes. It's just a practical part about being a professional musician, whether we're playing in a big band or even if we're playing in a small group situation. There are times where you just got to read it. And that is maybe not the most ideal setting, but it is something that we all have to do at some times. But if you're going to play music that is important to you, stuff that you really feel like connects with your creative impulses, you need to treat it with that level of importance, and you need to learn it so you can play it without reading it. It's just about honoring that music. Not only are you going to sound way, way better, but it's about really investing that process in that material that you are saying is important. The second reason I would really encourage you to take this aspect of your musicianship seriously is that the audience notices. You might think, well, the audience, they're not very informed. They don't know whether I'm reading this or not, or like I can play it really well reading it. What does it matter? Believe me, they know. Whether it's sort of an unconscious sort of just vibe of what you're projecting on stage, it's very different to have that music stand in front of you versus you just playing without the music stand. The audience is going to connect with you in a different way. Flip side of that, some people will 100% notice. Just a very short anecdote. I run a jazz education program for a large nonprofit where I live. And just a couple weeks ago, we had our final concert. This is with some like school age students. But part of that concert, the faculty for this program, we play a short set for the students. Because that was very important for me, for the students to see the musicians sort of like working in like real setting, I wanted to make sure that music was memorized. It was just a couple standards, couple arrangements of some tunes, so it was no big deal. After the concert, as some of the students are coming up to me and sort of saying their goodbyes, this is our final concert, a number of them asked me, was that music memorized? And you could see it in their faces, hear it in their voice that was something that, I don't want to say impressed them, but it left an imprint on them of like, oh, this is how you actually do this stuff. So whether it's school-age students, whether it's maybe people with, more developed musical palates, whatever, they will notice whether it is memorized. So take the time to invest, not only yourself, but how you kind of put yourself out there to the world and make sure you are learning some music, whether it be super standard material that, everybody plays and you feel like you have to know to sort of function as an improvising musician, that sort of perspective on it, or whether it's your own material that you feel very, sort of personally connected to. Make sure that when you go to the gig, you don't have to have a music stand in front of you whenever possible. It will improve your performance. It will improve the way the audience takes away from your performance. Cool. See you in the woodshed.